So hopefully I'm set up to get the steering installed. Got various tools, the parts kits that come with it, the Helm unit, various hole saws. So the first order of business is to locate and mount the helm. And it needs to be a minimum of 12 inches from the gunnel, which offhand I think my mark is, but I'm going to lay that out. There's a mounting template that I'm going to use to mark the holes, and then we're going to get that drilled and prepared. 12 inches minimum from the gunnel is to allow the steering cable to bend no more than the appropriate radius. The appropriate radius is 8 inches, 16-inch diameter. So wherever the cable comes through, I need 12 inches from there. I'm planning to use this 1.5-inch through hull to pass the cable through, as well as some wiring and stuff that has to go through from the controls here. So I'll figure out where that's going to go, and that can go pretty far over. I just need to leave room for I've got a 1.5-inch piece of pine framing behind this bulkhead on the back side. So as long as it clears that, a lot of considerations here. Okay, let's make a mess and drill some holes. Inside the bulkhead here, I've measured down roughly the same distance from the overhead and used the fixing nut to mark a rough outline. I want that to be as far over as it can go next to the hull, partly because that's how the cables are going to lead, and it gives me the most space to wherever the helm goes. So I'm going to drill a hole through from this side, and then we'll see where it ends up on the other side and drill the bigger hole. This is the template for the steering system that I'm going to use to mark the holes. I started off with this through hull location, which is where I'm going to run the cables through, and I mounted that about as close as I could without the fixing nut, which is about this diameter on the inside, without that running into the 1.5 inch of framework that's behind this. So that's what accounts for this position. And it's roughly level with the bottom of the controls, which is where that steering cable is going to run. And then this edge of the green tape is 12 inches from the center of that hole. So I needed a minimum of 12 inches from here to there. I've gone just a little further to this mark. And I chose this height by just holding the helm up. Keeps the whole wheel below the level of the top of the bulkhead, which seems right. So now I'm going to use a punch and mark. Well, the center hole's already marked for the big hole, but I'm going to mark those 3 bolt holes for the bracket, and then we hope this is all right. So I think that's the remaining holes required for the steering system and other things. And I've just epoxy coated those new holes on the inside, all of them. So we're going to let that cook for a little while, set up a bit before we continue, and in the meantime I'm going to do some other things around here. Now the helm unit is mounted to the bracket with 3 bolts on the inside. Because of how my cable comes in, I've chosen to mount this at a little bit of an angle. I have not seen anything that suggests that I can't do it that way, and it provides a better lead for that cable. This whole part of the cable that's currently covered in this little sheath will go inside the unit and then come out the bottom. It just gets wound right through there. So I'm trying to minimize the bend radius I have between there and here. So I think this will do it. We're going to find out. Steering's now complete. I've made an adjustment here. There is no guidance that I've found in the rigging manual that I have. There probably is online somewhere, but for which hole to use in this bracket. So I initially installed the drag link, that's this bar right here, in the outermost hole, the one closest to me. And the engine didn't turn very far. So, well, that's not right. So I figured it was moving it to one of those other holes, and I found through trial and error that the innermost hole is the best. Gives me the most travel in the engine, which I guess is logical, but if it's not, then now you know. So the steering cable runs in from my conduit here through the bulkhead. It's secured through the tilt tube and the outboard, and this is the business end that extends and retracts, moves the drag link, and moves the outboard. Over here along the starboard side right now I've got a mess. This is all my cables, control cables, steering cable, a transducer cable, the round black one, the small round black one, and then this blue wire is a 12-2 electrical cable for my chart plotter. And this stuff will all get secured and bundled at some point in the near future. But for now it's just hanging there. So I'll take care of that. Here's the helm, just a standard stainless wheel. It's got a suicide knob, which I like, and I've got a tack that's connected to the controls through this wiring harness that's dangling here. And I'll clean this all up at some point. Right now I'm just trying to get it installed. This is the back side of the helm unit. I installed it at a slight angle so that the cable would lead in as neatly as possible. It's a tough corner, but once I got it started, I was able to get this cable so that it kind of runs straight out through my little through-hull fitting. And it seems to operate well with no binding or stiffness, so I'm pretty happy with that. Again, I will clean up this wiring and stuff. I've got some more work to do. And I'll figure out a way to seal up that through-hull through which I ran this stuff. Just a plastic through-hull, 1.5 inches. And I needed every bit of it to get all this junk through there. So I'll put something in there so that it's generally waterproof. So a little bit more work. My next task is to connect the engine control cables, throttle and gear shift. And they go in the starboard side of the engine through this little thing right here. So I'm going to start taking this apart and get those hooked up. It's very frustrating to find out as I started to install the control cables that I didn't have the ends needed. I paid attention to everything when I unpacked the controls. Never saw anything. The ends were there to connect the cables to the control itself, and everything was hunky-dory until I went to hook up to the engine and realized that there wasn't anything. Transducer for the fish finder is now installed permanently. I pre-drilled and epoxy filled 2 holes through the transom. Let that cure overnight. And then this morning I drilled and tapped for number 10 machine screws, installed sealant, and installed it with bolts. Only because since the hull's only 3/8 here, it wouldn't allow a very long screw, so I just went with the bolts and nuts. So I've got to route the wire, but I've already led the wire forward to the helm area where I'm going to mount the plotter, so it's just a matter of cleaning things up now. To finish off the transducer installation, I installed several little clips to hold the cable. There's a little clip in the forward part of the bracket itself that holds it, and then I've got one up here under the outboard reinforcement and 2 more to lead it neatly up to the top. I like these rubber lined stainless steel clips. They're very easy on the wire. Got nice rubber linings, and they're stainless steel. And these are installed with stainless screws and sealant. And then from this corner forward, it's gonna, well, it does go through this bellows that I have. At the moment, I'm not sure how exactly it's gonna lead. I'd really like to just kind of clamp it to the control cables or something simple like that. So for the moment, I've taken it as far as I can until I get these cables connected and all of this cleaned up. But it's all secured as far as this transom corner, and the rest will work itself out in due course. Here in the compartment underneath the outboard well, I'm doing some preparatory work. I've installed 2 cleats that will accept not only the battery box between them in that space, but it also gives me a place to screw the battery box strap eyes. So I can't really screw to the bottom of this boat. It's just 5/8 plywood. So I've prepared the surface underneath with a light sanding. This is just epoxy on the surface here. And then I've epoxied those 2 cleats in place with a thickened epoxy adhesive mix. Similarly, I've epoxied this bilge pump and its switch to the bottom here. And I know that seems drastic, but I don't really know what else to do. And if and when the time comes that I need to replace these, then I'll chisel off a little epoxy and fix it. But again, I can't screw these things into the bottom like I normally would, and I don't want to put a cleat underneath them because it would raise them up higher than I would like. I want these to get as much water as possible. So those are epoxy. They're just plastic bases, so if I need to break them off in the future, I can. Finally, to help me install my outboard well cover in a way that's as water resistant as possible, I've epoxied 6 blocks, and they're all like this 2x4 except this one on the forward center, which 2x4 would stick out too far over the battery box and make that even more awkward than it's going to be. So here I just used a piece of pine, and on all these other places I have a piece of 2x4 cut at a 5-degree angle to match the angle of these cleats in 6 locations, 2 in the center, 2 on each edge. And what this will allow me to do is put a gasket all the way around on the outer cleats, and then the bolts that hold this down will go through these extra blocks and be inside of my gasket. I've got some bolts with sealing washers on them, kind of like you might use on a metal roof. So this is intended to be removable, not necessarily routinely, but quite possibly like once a year for access. I'm not really going to have access to the battery for connecting things when the cover is in, so it'll be a lot easier if I can take the cover off easily. I don't want to seal it with anything too aggressive, so I'm going to try this. It's really just to keep the bulk of the water out anyway. This does have limbers into the cockpit, so any water up there is going to drain in here. It's not a dry compartment, but if I do flood over the transom, the idea of this well is that it will drain out through the transom through 2 drains that are going to be there, and we'll talk more about those drains a little bit later when I actually do them. But I want to get this platform in place first, and this is my means for doing that. So these blocks are epoxied in place with the same mix as the bottom, and a little hot glue to hold it while the epoxy cures. It's nice and warm, so it won't take long. Later on in the day, once the adhesive had cured a bit, came back and painted some epoxy over all this bare wood, including the battery switchbacker, all these little blocks that are going to hold the outboard well top, and particularly these cleats here down on the bottom that are going to be around the battery box. Those will definitely be in water a lot of the time, so be sure to seal those up well. I've also installed this backing block on the forward bulkhead of the outboard well area, and that is to give me a place to mount this battery switch. This is one I've had kicking around, and I don't have 2 batteries on the boat, but this will work just fine with one. Again, that bulkhead is only 3/8, so it's just not enough meat for screws. is the battery I chose. Just a basic, quote, marine starting battery. 800 cold cranking amps, group 24, standard flooded wet cell. Nothing fancy, just Napa. So the engine wiring, well, not all of the engine wiring, but the engine battery harness and related wiring here is complete. I've still got some cleanup to do, but I have to figure out how these wires lead out of the outboard well. So that'll all be happening soonish. Bilge pump's wired only through the float switch. There's no panel switch. Wired directly to the battery, so it always works. It's not wired through this battery switch. However, this blue 2-part wire right here, that's going to feed my plotter, chart plotter, and that is wired through the switch. So that'll only work when the battery's turned on, and the engine will only start when the battery's turned on. So the switch is easily accessible through that locker opening. So as always, electrical stuff takes some time. By the time you figure out what you're doing and make the connections and heat shrink and all that stuff. But this is functional. Got the bilge pump wires secured up so they're out of the way. Hopefully there will never be any real water in here. We do what we can. So I've got to run a hose for that bilge pump. I think I'm probably just going to run it out over here underneath this and then up to a through hull in the side of the boat on the other side of the bulkhead somewhere. Just something that works as straight and simple as possible. I can't come out back here because it just complicates with this outboard well cover that goes in here. So here in the cockpit, to organize these cables and wires, I've laid out a line with my level running from near this bellows pass-through that I have, and basically a level line forward. Roughly, this is all roughly in way of where these cables naturally lead. And then I've gone through and made some marks where I'm going to install some mounts for wire ties. This is the forwardmost one, and that one's dictated by where this steering cable, which is not that flexible, kind of naturally lays in here. So that'll be the most forward one. And then 16 inches, roughly, that was dictated by where these control cables that come out of the control sort of lay down as well. They could go higher, but I have this mount trying to go below that. So 16 inches, and then we've got one more back here. Again, dictated basically by how this big heavy cable, steering cable, fits in there. I can't overly contort that because it'll affect the steering. So that's the aftermost one. And everything is going to secure to these with some wire mounts that I'm going to glue to the side of the hull. And that's the next step. I have to remove the paint everywhere I'm going to install one. So I'll just carefully make a little tiny area free of paint on each of these X marks. Prepared these 5 or 6 mount locations. Just scraped the glue off with a little tiny piece of very coarse sandpaper. It's a 2-inch roll-lock disc, like 40 grit. And the mounts are quite small, so they don't need a huge area prepared. Just enough so that the adhesive can bond with the substrate and not the paint. It will tend to pull paint off, maybe not the Alex seal, but I'm not going to take the chance. So now I'll install these little mounts. And there we are, 5 little glued in mounts. We'll just let those cure overnight. I'm not going to rush it. There's no hurry to tie these wires up. So we'll just leave those alone until it's time to tie this up permanently. I installed the prop, one of the last things to do. Put a little grease on the shaft and then bolted it in place. Calls for 18 foot-pounds on that little nut. I had to tighten it a little bit more to get the cotter pin through the castle nut. But there you have it. It's a propeller. Fuel filter installed. Not necessarily required, but a good idea. This is just a spin-on cartridge type Raycore. Got 2 in ports and 1 out port. This is the fuel coming in, which I've led down with a 90-degree fitting since we'll have a tank on the deck here with a hose leading up to it. And then this is the output that runs through the bellows and out to the engine, where I've made a connection with the hose that comes out of the engine. This comes with the engine right here. Got a connection. Because of the relative thinness of this bulkhead, it's 3/8 plywood, I bolted that filter through, and I chose to put the nuts on this side because they're kind of less in the way and less evident. So I've got 1/4-inch bolts, nuts and washers on this side, and on this side I have some nice big fender washers and the 1/4-inch panhead screws, machine screws. So it's a pretty clean look on the aft side. So at long last, here are my offending parts. This is what was missing from my outboard kit, and I don't know why, but these are the 2 ends required to connect the cables to the engine itself, and these are the little cotter pins and washers that are also used. And I think these should have been included. I don't know why they weren't. It was easier to just find them online and buy them than to try and fight with the vendor that sold me the outboard. I bought it online. I had the other ends of the cables, but these were definitely not in my kit. Anyway, I finally got them now. So now I can get back and hook up these control cables. Been waiting a little while for them, but they're finally here. It's time to get this engine hooked up completely. To remove this part of the cowl, there's 2 10mm bolts in there. One there, one back here. And that frees up the top half of this rubber thing. They call it a grommet. Cables are going to pass through here. Next, we remove this cable clamp, which is this metal piece, another 10mm bolt. And then it says to remove this cover, I guess for access to the wiring harness. Jesus, every wire in the thing goes through this. The wire harness on this engine has 2 plugs that come in out of 1 cord. And they plug in here. I had this cover off, as you saw. And that gave me a little room to get these plugged in. I could manipulate the wires out and get these connectors made up and then put the cover back on. And that cable runs through a hole in the bottom of this rubber grommet. It's this cable right here. That's going to be in the way. When I first led these through and was trying to reinstall the metal clamp for the control cables, which goes right over here, I didn't like how it was sitting with this particular part of the wire harness. It was definitely problematic. So I pulled a little more of the harness through here, and that gave me some more slack, and that way I can lead this back behind that mounting hole so that metal bracket is going to stay clear of that. So at long last, the two cables are hooked up. This is the shift. This is the throttle, the inner one. It's pretty tight in there. It's not the easiest thing to get these little pins and washers in. I dropped the pin once and the washer once. Goes way down into the depths way back there. I had to use a tool with tape sticky side out to get in there and grab those things. Real pain in the neck. I do fumble little stuff like this. It's very fiddly, very little room. I found to get the throttle, I could put the gear shift in forward. That gave me some more clearance. So anyway, these are connected. The little nuts are tight. I've adjusted these slightly. Once they fit in the groove here in this clamp, there's some minor adjustment needed on the threads of these two ends. But now it's just a matter of putting this cover back on. So let's get that done. So at long last, Outboard is fully connected, ready to be run. I've added oil. The engine came with 2 quarts of oil, 10W30. Took about 1.5 to 1 3/4 quarts. I'll check it once more right before I do a test run. Controls are hooked up, steering's hooked up, fuel is hooked up. Got the hoses and cables tied up as well as I can here. I've checked the operation side to side to make sure that when the engine's turned, there's plenty of slack, and there is. And that's why they're not secured to the steering cable. This is quite rigid. And these other cables, especially the battery cable coming out of the engine, it has basically just enough length for what I've done with it. So if I pull this over anymore, it gets too tight. And I made that adjustment during a test. This is fine. There's nothing going on back here except for what's going on back here. The throttle and gear shift cables, these things only bend so much, so these also are kind of doing their own thing here.